obviously I created a charity called Chasing the Stigma, and the reason why I chose those words because I don't believe that we're anywhere near getting rid or eradicating the stigma associated with poor mental health, and in particular suicide. I think we've done a lot recently, but there's still a long way to go. I think as a word, it still is something people feel really uncomfortable about, something that people don't necessarily talk about. If anybody is being affected by suicide, it's still something that we don't really talk about until we know that it's safe, or we know that somebody else has felt or experienced a similar thing. So what we wanted to do as a charity was to put that word stigma at the forefront of what we do, and to really try to talk about it and to address it, and to address that elephant in the room that is stigma. Because for me, stigma comes from ignorance. It comes from a void in knowledge and understanding. And I think when it comes to suicide, it's something that we don't really want to talk about. For me, as somebody who struggled with their mental health and then was feeling suicidal and eventually did make an attempt on my life, it's not something that I ever told anybody. It was not something that I felt I could talk to people about. I felt the burden, that huge weight of guilt, I think, which often came with, why am I feeling these feelings? And if I was to tell anybody else, if I was telling my girlfriend at the time, or my parents or my friends, what would they think of me? And so it was something that I carried alone, and all that was doing then was just manifesting every single day into something much, much bigger, much stronger as feelings. And, you know, if looking back and what I've learned since, you know, it's something that I know that if I would have been able to have that conversation, it wouldn't have been a scary conversation. It would have been something that actually I would have felt comfort from, I would have felt support from, and that there is help available. But the idea of that stigma being the reason why I didn't do that, you know, it's so cruel in many ways that we put ourselves under this undue pressure to keep it ourselves.
You know, it's only really recently that we've begun to open up the conversations, and what we've found just generally across the board is that actually having the conversations reduces the risk, you know. It opens the dialogue and allows for people to, you know, express their experience. And that is the, you know, number one predictor of somebody being able to move past that experience is expressing it. And I think sometimes the earlier and the more, I suppose, frequent those conversations are and those dialogues are, the less likely something is to build up and actually, you know, get to a kind of breaking point.
You know, the language, the state, for a lot of people, when they talk about somebody who's died by suicide, they will use the words commit. And that's something that, you know, maybe if you're not from the world where you are working within mental health and within that suicide arena, but for a lot of people, that word is just something that you would just say, but actually the meaning behind the word commit is because it was a crime for so long and to not that long ago. So even just the words that we use to associate somebody dying by suicide as being committed suicide is in itself is stigmatizing words that we don't necessarily know that when, or general public don't know that when they're using those words, but that kind of, as I say, the ignorance to that is just adding to the stigma that does exist.
Yeah, well, commit, you know, it implies, you know, it kind of has connotations of criminality, doesn't it, in some ways? You know, you'd commit a crime, you'd commit fraud. You know, these are things which are, you know, you'd associate with a degree of criminality, and, you know, people who are unwell or, you know, experiencing these experiences, you know, that approach to it is going to exacerbate everything. It's going to completely exacerbate everything, you know. For me, going through everything that I was going through, and as I said, I felt very isolated. I felt very, very lonely in that journey that I was going through. And I wasn't actually isolated. I wasn't actually lonely. I had, you know, lots of friends, family, girlfriend who's now my wife, and
You know, we had a really good, strong relationship. So I had a lot of people around me. But the feeling of isolation, the feeling of loneliness was that I felt like I was carrying this burden alone. I didn't tell anybody, I didn't share it with anybody, I didn't seek support, I didn't seek advice from those people. And I very much felt like it was a me problem. And reaching the point that I did, that, you know, the lowest point that I've ever been at, to think that I had no alternative and that the only way out of this was to take my own life. You know, that's a point that I didn't think I would ever get to. And being at that point, I really did worry, how am I ever going to be in any other state? How am I ever going to be well? How am I ever going to be me? How am I going to live a positive life? And for me, getting to that point was quite significant for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons was that suddenly it was there. It was on the table. Yeah. The people closest to me knew about it. There was no more hiding. There was no more pretending. There's no more lying. Actually, here it is. And being able then to have that conversation with those people closest to me, suddenly, all the things I feared, will they judge me? Will they use it against me? Will they believe me? All of these things, will they hate me? Will they be angry at me? All of these negative feelings I had for the reasons why I didn't tell people, why I didn't share with them, why I didn't talk to them. I'm not saying they vanished overnight, but a lot of them lifted. And actually the reaction I did get from those closest to me was of support, was of understanding. They didn't necessarily know what they could do to help me, but they offered everything that they possibly could do.
You know, I suppose there's a massive difference between the amount of social contact one has and the people one has around them and the actual amount of connection they get with those people. And one of the key, I guess, predictors of connection is authenticity, right? You know, being ourselves, whatever that experience is, not just when it's a nice experience. You know, it's sometimes quite easy to be authentic if you're feeling good, you're laughing, you're joking around. It's a lot harder and a lot more challenging to be authentic sometimes when that experience isn't on the more positive side of the spectrum. But without that authenticity, we don't get that connection, even with the people who genuinely really do want what's best for us. With the connection, we're further and further isolated, and that's what mental health can do to a person, and you know, ultimately breaking down the conversations and the stigma is what leads to people being able to be more authentic, which leads to the connection, which is actually one of the biggest preventative factors as well. If
I look back at myself 11 years ago and I just see this lonely young man who was carrying an absolute weight of the world on his shoulders, feeling like he had to do everything alone. He couldn't tell anyone, he couldn't be honest, he couldn't be truthful, he had to fix it himself. What I'd say is that there was no reason to do that alone. What I was feeling, what I was going through, all the symptoms, everything, it wasn't unique to me. Other people have felt it, other people have been through it, and crucially, other people have got well. I look at myself now, the life I am living now with my wife, with my 2 children, is a life I could never have dreamt of. When I was in that place, it seemed impossible. But it is possible. It has been possible. And I think rather than letting it get to the point that I did, if I was to give any advice, it's start that process earlier. Ask for help, get the support, and share with the people that you love and that love you, because they are there for you. So for me, one of the things I will always say to anyone, if they are worried about somebody who may be struggling, is to ask them. It's as simple, it really is simple as that. And it's not meant to be flippant. It's not meant to be disregarding of how difficult that can be. But one of the things that really struck me when I started to speak publicly about my own difficulties, people coming to me, complete and utter strangers, coming to me saying, I'm worried about my son, I'm worried about my dad, or I'm worried about, somebody else. And I'd say, have you spoken to them about it? And they say no. And that really struck me, that people were so scared and so worried, and rightly so, because they feel it's something that they're not skilled on. but they were so scared and so worried that they would rather come to a complete and utter stranger and ask them what they should do before they actually ask the person. And I think we build it up so much that we think it's going to be this really hard, intense conversation, and sometimes it may be. But I think having that conversation can really help somebody else. And it doesn't have to be sitting like this. It can be a conversation whilst you're just making a cup of tea, whilst you're in the car, whilst you're driving, whatever it might be. But I think have that conversation if you're worried about somebody in the same way that you worry about them in any other way. Have that conversation. Try to do it in the most normal, natural way that you normally would with that person. If you take them out of that normal environment, it's not going to, automatically the guard is going to be up. But ask them, and you know what? You might not get the answer straight away. But you can build the platforms, you can plant the seeds, you go back. I know that if someone asked me, I'd probably say I'm fine. But then if they'd ask me again, and they'd done it in a way that wasn't like accusing, then probably I'd say, well, you know, I am feeling like this, and things building that reassurance is really important. But don't put it off, because you're going to have that conversation eventually.
I suppose maybe you could term it olive branching, which I think is another way to maybe softly do that if one is feeling a bit trepidatious around approaching somebody for that conversation, which is, you know, maybe not, you know, if you don't feel comfortable kind of directly going in, it may be, you know, something as simple as, you know, I've got half an hour later, if you want to catch up and you want to talk about things, you know, I know things may have been on your plate recently, then, you know, hit me up and we can go do that, you know. And I think being quite casual about it, I guess that's the subtlety to it, isn't it? You know, it's being casual about things. And I suppose we're not very casual about things that sometimes we fear, because I think people fear what they don't understand, and they demonize what they don't understand. And for, you know, a lot of people, if they know somebody who is experiencing negative mental health, you know, if they are somebody who hasn't potentially experienced, you know, mental health trials and tribulations of their own, they might have that attitude of being quite maybe avoidant, quite fearful of it, and you know, therefore not feel comfortable being casual about it. And you know, it's really breaking that down, because the second you are casual about that conversation, you know, you realize it's a conversation. It's not anything more or less than that, you know.
I always heard that suicide is a selfish act. And so what I would say as somebody who has been there, felt that way and was suicidal, attempted to take my own life, what I can hand on heart say is that for me, that was a selfless act. It's what I fundamentally believed, that me doing that was not just about me, it was about making the life of those around me easier. I felt like I could never be better, I could never be helped, I was never going to be me again. And I just felt like such a burden to all of those around me that I felt taking myself out the equation was the absolute best thing for them. So for me, it was categorically, in my mind, a selfless act, not a selfish act.
Yeah, when we speak to people who've had such experiences, you know, that's what we unanimously hear essentially, is that it is quite the opposite. You know, it's a means of protecting and insulating the people around someone, and that's what it's very much viewed as within that experience. And there are many instances where you'll find people aren't speaking about it because perhaps they even don't, they almost are averse to having attention put on them around it. You know, somebody would be far more likely in many instances to speak in a one-to-one capacity than they would be to, you know, say it in a particularly attention-drawing setting, which again really would contradict that entire premise essentially, as that's not how it occurs in practice.
But the biggest thing that I would say to anyone who is struggling with their own mental health, who may be suicidal, we've touched on this today when we've talked about feeling like it is forever, feeling like there's no alternative, feeling like there's no hope. And I absolutely promise, from the bottom of my heart, from my own experience, that absolutely is a way through. There is an alternative. There is a positive, healthy life that is out there waiting for you. It may take time. Might not change overnight, but taking it a step at a time, giving yourself the best chance, giving somebody else the best chance, have that conversation with them, will absolutely be worth it.
I think the idea of steps is really key, actually. And I think one of the things is, trying to figure out what that first step is rather than those first 10 steps. Because if you are somebody who's never reached out, if you are somebody who hasn't spoken about this, if you are somebody who's never spoken with maybe somebody who's a therapist or counsellor, the thoughts of all of that might be quite daunting in many ways. And we can talk about how, well, it's obviously a really good thing. There is lots of support out there. There are people who are going to be able to understand and empathise and help and be able to, allow you to find that hope again. You've got to find that for yourself as well. You've got to experience that for you to then believe that. And that comes down to, well, what's that next step for you? It may be a conversation with a close friend. It may be a conversation with a family member. It may be simply just doing a little bit of research on, the support and the resources that are out there. And you'll often find that, that one proactive step can then make the others not feel as daunting and not make you feel as though you're on such a long road and you don't know where it's going to end. And I suppose if you can't find hope and you don't see a way out, it's trusting that you don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. Even if you don't know or have hope now, who's to say what will happen in tomorrow, in a week, in a month, in a year? We don't know the future. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. And ultimately, the enemy is losing hope. And we've got to do whatever we can to find that again.